Okay, we're back and we're battling here with the ideas of what do we live on? What do we live on, folks? I mean, is it moving? Is it stationary? Is it flat? Is it round? Is it a triangle? Is it something different? The point is in this show, I'm just not going to believe in anything, okay? And I really don't believe in any one of these theories. I'm just trying to search and open my mind enough to think about things in a different way. Because I know once I say something like gravity may not exist according to certain people, people are going to write in and go, here's why it exists. And they're going to give me a lot of these scientific theories, right? And Isaac Newton and Einstein's theories. I mean, they're very complicated to me sometimes. I've tried to look at them. And not to say that, let's say, fine. If you think, don't give me this, I believe. If you write me an email and say, I believe the earth is round, I'm not going to answer. Because I don't want to talk about beliefs. And I've been guilty of that in the past too. And I'm trying to correct it today. So don't give me the beliefs. Just say, I have heard that certain scientists say the gravity is such and such. But the question then is now, with those little examples I gave, let me give you another one. Without talking about being a smart scientist, just observable, just certain things. How many things can you think of that kind of, are mystifying in a sense? To me, this idea of gravity holding millions of gallons, billions of gallons of water, heavy, to the earth, doesn't that give you this idea that everything should be sucked down to the ground? Then how come a bird can fly? Shouldn't he be sucked right down? I mean, I was watching some gulls out in the ocean today, they'd be kind of suspended in animation. They're not flying, they're just hovering, right? How come that the gravity doesn't suck them down? But it can hold all the billions of gallons of water and all this stuff to the earth. Supposedly can hold you too, but this bird seems to be anti-gravity proof or something. Okay. The fact that lighter things rise up and heavier things fall down could be simply a natural property of weight, right? That's very different from gravity, isn't it? Gravity is a hypothetical. And that's really what it is. Magnetic-like force possessed by large masses of things, which Isaac Newton needed to help explain to get his heliocentric theory of the universe into people's minds, schools, and into globes all over the place. Right? Now, Lady Blount, I found this quote from Clarion's Science versus God's Truth. She wrote that. On page 40, she said, most people in England have either read or heard that Sir Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation was originated by his seeing an apple fall to the earth from a tree in his garden. Persons gifted with ordinary common sense would say that the apple fell down to the earth because bulk for bulk, it was heavier than the surrounding air. But if instead of the apple, a fluffy feather had been detached from the tree, a breeze would have probably sent the feather floating away, and the feather would not reach the earth until the surrounding air became so still that by virtue of its own density, the feather's density, the feather would fall to the ground. Okay. Now, pulling this from another book, Wilbur Voliva, a famous flat earther. Yes, there's been people in the past that call themselves that. In the early 20th century. So we don't have to go back to the cavemen to think about this. Gave lectures all over America against Newtonian astronomy. He would begin by walking on stage with a book, a balloon, a feather, and a brick, and ask the audience, how is it that a law of gravitation can pull up a toy balloon and cannot pull up a brick? I throw up this book. Why doesn't it go up and up and up? That book went up as far as the force behind it forced it to, and it fell because it was heavier than the air, and that is the only reason. I cut the string of the toy balloon, it rises, gets to a certain height, and then it begins to settle. That's one without helium, okay? I take this brick and a feather, I blow the feather, yonder it goes. Finally, it begins to settle and comes down. The brick goes up as far as the force it is forced up, and then it comes down because it's heavier than the air. That is all, he said. Now, David Wardlow Scott, in a book called Terra Firma, said this: any object which is heavier than the air and which is unsupported has a natural tendency to fall by its own weight. Newton's famous apple at Woolsthorpe, or any other apple when ripe, loses hold of its stalk and being heavier than the air, drops as a matter of necessity to the ground, totally irrespective of any attraction of the earth. For if such attraction existed, why does not the earth attract the rising smoke, which is not nearly so heavy as the apple? The answer is simple: because the smoke is lighter than the air, and therefore does not fall, but ascends. Gravitation is only a subterfuge employed by Newton in his attempt to prove that the earth revolves around the sun, and the quicker it is relegated to the tomb of the Capulets, he said, the better will it be for all classes of society. Okay. Now, I love some of this stuff. I found this in a book called Zealetic Cosmogony. Cottage cheese. Zealetic cottage cheese. No. The law of gravitation is said by the advocates of Newton's system of astronomy to be the greatest discovery of science and the foundation of the whole of modern astronomy. If therefore it can be shown that gravitation is a pure assumption and an imagination of the mind only, that it has no existence outside of the brains of its expounders and advocates, the whole of the hypotheses of this modern so-called science fall to the ground as flat as the surface of the ocean. And this must exact of all sciences. This wonderful feat of the intellect becomes at once the most ridiculous superstition and the most gigantic imposture to which ignorance and credulity could ever be exposed. Now, what I'm thinking is people that have argued this and say, hey, you're crazy, gravity exists, they love to rely on these people like Einstein's theory of relativity, these entire equations on a blackboard, and they basically are believing, he's a genius, so he's right. So they just believe what other people are telling them. Do your own, just drop an apple. Do some real simple stuff. And what I'm saying is that people, especially modern man, has become a non-thinking person, basically. They don't want thinking people here. And they're going to call anybody that believes in the flat earth goofy, and they don't want anybody to think, because, that could get into their Nassau pocketbook. That could change everything, right? Boy, they'd look like fools, wouldn't they? But they're going to make you look like a fool if you start thinking. So they want you to believe Einstein, Newton, and all these people because it sounds good. It's a good hypothetical model, and boy, I'm telling you, if you disagree, my goodness, will they come down on you. So you got Einstein's theory of relativity and the entire heliocentric model of the universe upon Newton's law of gravity. These heliocentrists claim that the sun is the massive object in the heavens, more massive than the earth, and therefore the earth and other planets by law are caught up in the sun's gravity and forced to orbit perpetually, circles, ellipses around it. They claim that gravity also somehow allows people, buildings, the oceans, and all of nature to exist on the underside of their ball earth without falling off. And I guess people who believe in the Bible stating that the earth is a sphere have to believe in gravity as well. Or is there something I'm missing? So I guess all of you that are thinking about this, do a little observation yourself. I mean, you'll say, well, yeah, that does make sense, but Jesus, it can't be that way. Look at these geniuses telling me. And so they rely on these, like a blackboard full of x squared minus b squared equals x2g squared. And really, they confuse you. They confuse you into believing them. And because we have so many non-thinking people in the in these modern man has become more or less, they're on the way to being a robot. This idea that it could be anything other than what they tell us is absurd. Now, even if gravity did exist, okay, why would it cause both planets to orbit the sun and ask to stick to the Earth? And people stick to the Earth. Okay? Gravity should either cause people to float in suspended circular orbits around the Earth, or it should cause the Earth to be pulled and crashed into the sun. What sort of magic is gravity that it can glue people's feet to the ball Earth, and glue everything, glue everything like the oceans, while causing Earth to itself revolve ellipses around the sun? The two effects are very different, yet the same cause is attributed to both. Okay, here's an example I found from N. Crossland, New Principia, a book. Take the case of a shot propelled from a cannon. By the force of the explosion and the influence of the reputed action of gravitation, the shot forms a parabolic curve and finally falls to the Earth. Here we may ask why. If the forces are the same vis-a-vis direct impulse and gravitation, does not the shot from an orbit like that of a planet and revolve around the Earth? The Newtonian may reply, because the impulse which propelled the shot is temporary, and the impulse which propelled the planet is permanent. Precisely so, but why is the impulse permanent in the case of a planet revolving around the sun? What is the cause of permanence, he asks. Well, in Sun, Moon, and Stars, page 27, a man by the name of, I believe it's a man, it's A. Gebaron, maybe it's a woman, maybe it's a gender neutral, neither man or woman. Yeah, isn't that a crazy theory going around? You know, there's a couple, just to get off here on this gender, maybe I should do a show on gender neutral, or at least a 5-minute comedy routine on it. But gender neutral is now very, very important to a lot of millennial parents and people growing up in a world where they're looking back at modern, the old generations and generations that have gone for hundreds of years and say, you were crazy to just think they're only men and women. That is not right. Gender neutral. Well, they start out by only doing this. We're not going to make sure a boy's room is blue, or we buy blue baby clothes. We're not going to buy pink baby clothes for a girl because we're not sure what he is, or she is. We're not saying. So it starts with that, and it gets completely crazy after that. There's a couple in Toronto. The baby, the child is like 3 years old, but they have not yet distinguished if it's a boy or a girl. This on any kind of records or documents or anything, and they're not referring to him to their friends or anything as a boy or a girl. They're going to let the boy or girl decide for the boy or girl's self, and they're claiming this child is gender neutral now. Oh boy, I'm telling you, now you know why I'm doing stories on the flat Earth. Those would drive me crazy. But anyway, let's look at this idea. Mr. Gebaron here said in Sun and Moon and Stars, if the sun is pulling with such power at the Earth and all her sister planets, why do they not fall down upon him? Okay? Furthermore, this magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world. There's no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object which by virtue of its mass alone causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it. There's nothing on Earth massive enough that it can be shown to cause even a dusty bunny to stick to the orbit around it. Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off. Nothing sticks to or orbits it. To claim the existence of a physical law without a single practical evidentiary example is nothing more than hearsay, right? Not science. And I got that quote from a place called Flat Earth 101. And it also says this, that bodies in some instances are seen to approach each other is a fact, but that their mutual approach is due to an attraction or pulling process on the part of these bodies is, after all, a mere theory. Hypotheses may be sometimes admissible, but when, this is coming from Lady Blount on Albert Smith and the Zetetic Astronomy, but when they are invented to support other hypotheses, they are not only to be doubted, but discredited and discarded. The hypotheses of a universal force called gravitation is based upon and was indeed invented with a view to support other hypotheses, namely that the Earth and the sea together make up a vast globe, while whirling away through space and therefore needing some force or forces to guide it in its mad career, and so control it as to make it conform to what is called its annual orbit around the sun. The theory, first of all, makes the Earth to be a globe, then not a perfect globe, but an oblate spheroid, flattened at the poles, then more oblate, until it was in danger of becoming so flattened that it would be like a cheese. And passing over minor variations of form, we are finally told that the Earth is pear-shaped, and that the ellipsoid has been replaced by, and I don't even know what this is, an apoid. I have to look that up. Yes, Greg, you don't know all the words in the world. What shape it may assume next, we cannot tell. It will depend upon the whim or fancy of some astute and speculating scientist. Lady Blount. Okay, somebody's asked, why are you doing this? Well, let me tell you, I think it's a good learning experience. Because if you can get to a point of not believing NASA and Newton and getting away from beliefs and saying, boy, some of this stuff doesn't make sense, it's gonna really kind of trickle down to many other things in the world that you may have gotten the wrong impression of. And so it really helps to say, listen, if I have to believe this based on these hypothetical theories, man, I'll believe anything, won't I? And they got me. They can tell me anything from Washington, they can tell me anything from the Vatican, and I'm going to believe them because they are powerful, they are smarter than the average human being. Well, in fact, people are deceptive. And so that's why I say, before you start saying, I believe this, I believe that, have a good look at a lot of things, okay? And try to use a little bit of observation instead of persuasion, so to speak, all right? Okay, how much time do I got? Oh, only about 5 minutes. Boy, how time flies when you're having fun, right? So, we are really getting deep into this theory of gravity, right? And there's so much about it. I'm looking, people should be spinning, let's see if we can find, there's so much on it. I could read and read and read, but let's look at something here. Okay. Let's start here. We're asked by the Newtonian people to believe that the action of gravitation, this is N. Crosland, again in New Principia, which we can easily overcome by the slightest exercise of volition in raising a hand or a foot, is so overwhelmingly violent when we lose our balance and fall a distance of a few feet, that this force, which is imperceptible under usual conditions, may under extraordinary circumstances cause the fracture of every limb we possess. Common sense must reject this interpretation. Gravitation does not furnish a satisfactory explanation of the phenomena here described, whereas the definition of weight already given does. For a body seeking in the readiest manner its level of stability would produce precisely the result experienced. Okay, it's getting complicated. But heliocentrists claim the ball Earth, how fast do they say it's moving? Is perpetually spinning on its axis at a mind-numbing 1,038 miles per hour. How did they get that? Why not 1,039? Or 19 miles per second? And somehow people, animals, buildings, oceans, and other surfaces phenomena can stick to the underside of the spinning ball without falling or flying off. Take a ride on a graviton at your local amusement park. However, and notice how the faster it spins, the more you are pushed away from the center of the spin and not towards it. Even if the inward pulling force of gravity did exist, which it does not in this man's mind, Mr. Crossland, the centrifugal outward pushing force of the ball Earth's supposed 19 mile per second spin would also exist, and having to be overcome, yet neither of these opposing forces have ever shown to have any existence outside the imagination of these scientists who had to come up with it. It's like, okay, we have to prove, instead of going, okay, we have proven the Earth is a spinning ball, they have come to the conclusion it's a spinning ball, and now they have to figure out a way to prove it. That doesn't make sense, does it? That's exactly what they did. There's so much. We can get into the moon and all this stuff, but I find it a fascinating experience because I only have 2 minutes, so I'll end it there. But think about gravity and, use some observations. Try to get away from the whole lesson of today's show was, let's look at certain things without believing them or disbelieving them. And I know that, for example, let's also look what the Hindus think. They said, you may believe that the Earth is flat, or you may believe it's round and spinning, or round, and then you're just going to have to do a whole study of it to one day disbelieve that. And then it couldn't go the other way around too. So let's say you believe, you grow up believing the Earth is flat, then you're going to do a whole thing where you're going to have to study the heliocentric model, and you've realized that you've made a mistake, and now you believe in the helio. Can you get to that point? I think it's really hard going that way in this subject because when you start thinking about it, you're going to start relying on all these crazy things that Newton and Einstein said. And then you're relying on speculation. You're then believing in something, not really using your own power of rational thinking to do that. You're a thinking human being. And you're also allowed to think and have it be not right. And discuss it with other people and change that. So it's not really as cut and dry as we think. And I think people get all uptight, but don't look at the big picture of why this story is important, because it'll open your mind to so many other things, so many other of these truth movements, and give it a little bit more meaning, because you'll get away from being persuaded, and you'll get away from your belief systems that sometimes were formed because of you were basically apprehended into believing them. Back next week on the Investigative Journal.